This next story also has to do with money and the revolt in the region. Poverty and skyrocketing food prices have fueled some of the protests. And some analysts argue economics are playing an even bigger part. Just listen to what Dambisa Moyo has to say. Her ideas have made her not just one of the leading commentators on global affairs, but also one of the most provocative. Moyo spoke to Amanda Lang.
Dambisa Moyo isn't afraid to court controversy. She may be as close to a celebrity as an economist can get, and young and old flock to hear the Zambian-born, Oxford-educated Moyo's ideas. Moyo's latest book, How the West Was Lost, is already a bestseller. It offers up a gloomy outlook for the United States.
And the theme is this idea of unintended consequences, good intentions that yield bad economic outcomes.
And true to form, Moyo has a theory about the world that will be shocking to some. We sat down with her recently and started with the less controversial, how the West is losing its way.
The reason it's entitled How the West Was Lost is because clearly the West, the United States, North America, European countries have lost their way. And this book is really detailing how it is over the last several decades. Policies sort of gone awry and therefore put it on the wrong path.
We think now of what's happening in the Middle East and in North Africa and how destabilized that region is, and wonder about a future when the U.S. doesn't play that sort of lead dog, alpha dog role in setting a tone for democracy, for freedom, for civil rights. Do we need to worry about that?
We do need to worry about that, but I would argue that what we're seeing in the Middle East in particular, but also, I'm hearing of some sort of sporadic uprisings coming in other places across Africa. I think is really emblematic of frustration, economic frustration, more than necessarily democracy per se. Not only are we seeing a lack of improvement in terms of economic growth, but the poverty levels are still astounding. And so I think that's where the frustration really emanates from. So I think the more fundamental issue is, can we actually deliver economic improvements and improvements of living standards to all these people around the world who are now convinced that it's almost an entitlement, and that's where the United States really has to come up with a serious answer.
When you think about what is happening in the Middle East, in North Africa, what's your expectation that that will settle or resolve in a way that is peaceful for those people and creates prosperity?
The issue, again, is about people's tolerance and patience around lack of delivery of better living standards. And, in the near term, of course, places like Egypt, we'll see what happens within the next year. We're seeing it in Greece. We're seeing it in the United States. There's nothing that says that we won't see it much more in countries where there's a very, very large young population and people are disaffected.
So can the U.S. play the role it likes to play, that of a beacon for fledgling democracies?
Ultimately, we do need the United States to take a leadership role. But as long as the U.S. doesn't solve the problems at home, this education, energy, infrastructure. I was just in some of the American cities, a few American cities, and the infrastructure is atrocious. If they can't get those things right, then how will they actually be able to offer advice or to be strong enough to offer support to some of the most impoverished countries in the world?
And then the controversial idea. For those nations that find themselves with a vacuum of leadership, Moyo thinks it isn't America that will be the guide, but China.
What's there not to admire? I think on the one hand, we have to commend them for what they've done. They've moved hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in a short space of time. And I think, the fact that we live at a time when the first and second largest economies, the U.S. and China, have two essentially different models of politics and essentially different models of economics. And so I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that democracy is a prerequisite for economic development. It clearly isn't the case. We've seen China and Singapore and a number of other countries around the world achieve long-term economic growth and reduce poverty without having democracy in place. Now, I was just in China for a couple of weeks, and I think that there's definitely this idea that they have a race against a revolution, the concern that, if they cannot continue to deliver economic growth, people will become more frustrated and there'll be much more political instability. I think what sets China apart from, say, what we are seeing in North Africa is that they are delivering an economic growth. They are reducing poverty.
And an even edgier idea from Moyo. Economic well-being may just trump political freedom.
Clearly, we want to aspire to a world where there's free and fair democracy, free rights, liberal democracies. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you can achieve that level of democracy without a middle class on the ground that's able to hold the government accountable. And that, to me, suggests that you need to get the economics right first before you get the democracy that we would like to see.
All right, interesting interview, provocative, just as you promised. Now, her book is really focused on her theory that the U.S. has lost its way.
Yeah.
Now, if true, that's got implications for a lot of other places.
It does, places that the world is watching pretty closely right now. Moyo offers up a reminder to us that while we may be tempted to see the unrest in countries like Libya and Egypt as really a fight for democracy, it's also a fight about prosperity. And we tend to think our system is the best way to raise people out of poverty. She points out China's shown that there is another way. And at this pivotal moment in the history of some nations, it may not be democracy that looks the most attractive.
All right. Thanks, Amanda.